first of all, thank India Today very warmly for the invitation, very distinguished forum. It's a great pleasure to be here. And maybe I should just go straight to the exam question that you've posed, which is, can capitalism be compassionate? And I'll try to do it by going back 2.5 centuries to the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, who indeed tried to address this. I think he was probably the first person to do so, though maybe the French would dispute that. He tried to set out in a coherent way, in a book called The Wealth of Nations, the intellectual case for a competitive free trading system, or capitalism, as being the best way to generate wealth and rising living standards. But actually, he wrote 2 books. The other, which is less well known, was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it argued that capitalism also must have a moral underpinning. Not compassionate in the sense of being sentimental and soft-hearted, but anchored in the rule of law, in honesty, and respect for social values. Now, the intervening period, particularly the 20th century, has seen experiments with a wide variety of alternatives, various forms of socialist communist state planning and nationalistic autarky. And I think it's fair to say that all of them have failed. And with a few pathological exceptions, like North Korea, the modern world has now largely converged on the central argument which Adam Smith advanced all those years ago. Having said that, capitalism comes in many forms. In my own country, as in the United States, we have what's sometimes called Anglo-Saxon capitalism, open, competitive, and with leading companies owned by private shareholders who are institutionally separated from management. But there are many other models. The French is more dirigiste. The Germans have what's sometimes called a Rhenish model, built around a consensus between employers and unions and the state, and depends also on a backbone of middle-sized family-owned companies, the so-called Mittelstand. Elsewhere, the Japanese, since over the last century and a half, have evolved, again, a very different kind of capitalism based on large family companies, the keiretsu, working closely with a somewhat nationalistic state machine. Korea, or South Korea, has produced a variant of that in modern times. And in the last 30 years, we've seen the emergence of a very successful form of capitalism in communist China, which is based on different types of state-owned enterprises alongside first-generation entrepreneurs backed by the state. And perhaps the best way of characterizing that is state capitalism. And probably state capitalism is the best way of describing many of the new emerging economies, especially countries like Russia and Brazil, which are resource intensive or have oil. And of course, here in India, there is again, a very distinctive form of capitalism, very diverse, but also very successful, with the big family conglomerates, a large number of highly entrepreneurial middle-sized companies, a vibrant stock exchange in Mumbai, which I think now has more listed companies than any other except possibly New York and London, roughly the same size, and also has a financially sophisticated middle class of savers and investors. So what we call capitalism is extremely diverse. It's also rapidly changing. If we think back a generation ago, it didn't exist in mainland China. though Chinese family businesses were already driving growth across Southeast Asia. A generation ago, as many of you in this room will remember, Indian companies hadn't even begun to become global and were subject to very heavy state regulation. And in the UK, our form of capitalism was largely then British-owned, and it was heavily industrial, but now foreign ownership is the norm. Indeed, our biggest manufacturing company in the UK now is Indian-owned. And if we look back at how India has evolved and how India's form of capitalism has changed over the years. I first came here almost half a century ago, and I'm struck by the pace and scale of change every time I come here. When I first came in the mid-1960s, there was no green revolution, let alone an IT revolution. The big Indian houses, Birlas, Tatas, Mafatlals, they were tolerated rather than encouraged and were very heavily controlled. The middle class was very small and disgruntled, and all the intellectuals I met were entranced by the miracles of Soviet planning or the potential of Maoist revolutions. And I recall vividly when I first visited the factory which my brother-in-law ran just outside what was then Bombay. And his whole life was dominated by getting licenses from bureaucrats and avoiding garaus by his unionized staff. I mean, capitalism was then an endangered species. And it's now anything but that. It's totally and utterly transformed. So in this very, very diverse and rapidly evolving world of different kinds of capitalism, can we describe it meaningfully as compassionate? Well, individual businessmen may well be philanthropists, but is the system compassionate? And that's the question that you've put to us. I think what we can say, without any doubt, is that it has been extraordinarily successful in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That's most strikingly the case in China. But in India, rapid growth has had the effect of reducing the proportion of the population in absolute poverty in the last 3 decades from 2/3 to 1/3. That's obviously approximate, but that's the World Bank estimate, and I don't think many of you would challenge that. And in the process, creating, again, according to definition, a very large middle class. So this modern globally integrated capitalism with a rapid diffusion of technology and ideas, the opening up of markets, the opportunities it presents for the talented, and you have disrupted credit supply. And we and other countries have learnt the hard way that financial markets are not self-correcting and that financial capitalism is potentially toxic unless it's properly regulated. Now, I think where we are now in the broad debate about the future of capitalism is that there are very few people on the one hand who will argue for unfettered laissez-faire, for just letting markets rip. But equally, there is a high level of skepticism about government's ability to plan and direct and control. I think very little belief anymore that inward-looking trade and national ownership is a sensible way to proceed. The issues now, I think, are different. One is how governments can intervene optimally to support an emerging knowledge economy through innovation, education, infrastructure. It's the question about how far governments can go to redistribute income and wealth and develop social welfare when they have to balance that against international competitiveness. And it's also about how to maintain a sense of identity which isn't narrow and inward-looking and xenophobic. I mean, those seem to me the core questions which capitalist countries in their many diverse forms have to deal with. And on the latter point, one of the bitter lessons from the last major crisis in capitalist economies in the 1930s is that financial crisis feeds recession and depression that can then fuel inward-looking nationalism, protectionism, and conflict. And that we have to avoid. And so far, we've done so. The multilateral trade and financial institutions, new groupings like the G20, and indeed informal networking of the kind that you've organized today, have all provided the glue to maintain a framework of cooperation. And perhaps I should just say in conclusion that that is very much the spirit in which I'm visiting India today. In the UK, we think we have something to celebrate this year. We've got the Olympics, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, and we're celebrating it, as you've just heard from the Prime Minister, through what we call the Great Britain campaign, promoting what we do best, advanced manufacturing, creative industries, world-class universities, and we want to develop as close a partnership as is possible with countries like India. We happen to have historic ties, but that isn't enough, because a modern strategic relationship's got to be based on mutual self-interest, trade, investment, security, and common values. And that's what our great campaign is designed to achieve. And the main message of that campaign is that Britain is indeed a great country, as India is a great country, and that we have a great partnership, past, present, and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cable. A very interesting talk about the different forms of capitalism and what the future holds. Mr. Kapil Sibal.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Vince talked about Adam Smith, so let me just give you some thoughts of mine on Adam Smith before I start. Just some snippets, and I'll come back to this a little later. This laissez-faire has come apart. The end is here. Rebuild and start. Late Adam Smith cannot provide a recipe to turn the tide. We'll have to go somewhere else to turn the tide. My take on this is that capitalism per se needs a huge transformation if we want to really deliver for the people. And there is an intrinsic tension between capitalism and compassion. Though I believe that perhaps capitalism is the only form of economy that actually can deliver for people. So it's really a necessary evil in a sense, because capitalism, however, what it does is it divides riches unequally. And socialism divides poverty equally. And so we naturally have to move away from socialism because there's no point in distributing poverty. And at the same time, we cannot accept the fact that capitalism as a system, when it works, tends to bridge the gap, increase the gap between the rich and the poor. So how can capitalism become compassionate? And I doubt very much that capitalism will ever be compassionate. Unless, of course, the entrepreneurs who are the front runners in capitalism realize at some stage that it is in their interest to actually work for the good of the people and ensure that the profit motive is not the prime factor in ensuring their own prosperity, and that profit, when distributed, in fact, increases their prosperity. And that's the transformation that I think is required to take place as we move forward. The fact of the matter is that, that the market is not a magic wand. The fact of the matter is that markets don't necessarily go forward in a rational fashion. The global crisis has demonstrated that in inadequate measure. And so, what do we need to do? And I think each country, as Vince rightly pointed out, has different forms of capitalism, and each country needs to find its own solutions. But I think globally, there is a global trend that's happening, and that we need to recognize. And that global trend is that the information technology revolution has brought information to the doorsteps of millions of people that had no access to information before. What has that done? It's changed the attitude of people towards governments. It has also changed the attitude of people towards business. It's also changed the attitude of business towards the aspirations of people. And I think that the driving force in the transformation of capitalism, at the heart of that is the information technology revolution. And I think that once we recognize that fact, and you see that happening already in industry and in business, that businesses are realizing more and more that it is in their interest to actually distribute the wealth in adequate measure, to increase levels of prosperity around them, which in turn gives the consumer a greater purchasing power, which in turn fuels the economy, and which in turn increases prosperity. That's the cycle that I'd like to see happen as we move forward. But that's easier said than done. Take India, for example. If you really look at since 1991 to 2012, our GDP rate is pretty good. Even in the worst of years, our GDP would be 6.9%. The last 2 years, it was 8.4%, the last two fiscals. But has it brought succor to the poor? Have 500 to 700 million people benefited from an 8.4% GDP? Has that prosperity trickled down to ordinary folks? And the answer is no. So is that an index of happiness? Is that the way that capitalism should move forward? Or is there something else that we need to do? And it's in that context, ever since 1991, Indian democracy has been moving towards an experiment that has never taken place anywhere else in the world. And that experiment is in the form of our economic policy when we use the phrase inclusive growth. And I think at the heart of this concept of inclusive growth is what I called inter se equity. In other words, unless you have equity inter se communities, unless you have equity inter se business, government, and the consumer, you're not going to reach anywhere. And I think at the heart of inclusive growth is to achieve that inter se equity. And at the heart of achieving that inter se equity is what I call equal opportunity meritocracy. And that's very fundamental. You can have a system of capitalism which does not provide equal opportunity to people, and that capitalism is bound to, it will never survive. But if you are able to provide your people with equal opportunity meritocracy, in other words, give schooling to every child, ensure that every child has health care, ensure that when children move up to higher education, they're entitled to loans. Ensure that every family has a roof over their head. Ensure that transportation is cheap. Ensure that every family has access to water. Ensure that every family has access to sanitation. In the absence of that, in the absence of all these fundamentals, you'll not be able to create the equal opportunity meritocracy, which is fundamental, I think, to any form of capitalism that has to be successful. And that's really at the heart of the problem. And India is grappling with that. And that's the reason why, even in the last budget, you see the finance minister actually continuing on the programs which involve a lot of expenditure, because it is that inter se equity that we have to realize for our people for the purposes of providing the equal opportunity meritocracy to all citizens of India. And that's no easy task, because while you do that and your expenditure increases, you at the same time have to generate growth, because you have to, ultimately all this comes from taxes. And unless you give incentives to the rich and to industry, you'll not be able to get the growth to provide the money for the kind of changes that we want to be able to achieve that equal opportunity meritocracy. So this is a very difficult task to perform. And I guess each country has its own problems in this context. To look at, for example, the Eurozone. What's happened in the Eurozone? Why did the whole concept of the European market come into being? Because suddenly it was realized that countries were too small to be able to take advantage of the limited markets that they had. And therefore, to provide equity to themselves as nations, they had to extend the market so that they have greater access to larger markets, so that they can in turn bring about prosperity not only to themselves, but also distribute prosperity. But of course, that experiment is an enormous experiment, but how far it's going to be successful is something that we've yet to see, because of the nature of the European economies and the way people have overspent, both in Europe as well as in the United States of America. I mean, if capitalism means living beyond your means, what it does is that it lives off other people's money. You borrow money from the bank, and you pay 1/50th the installment, and you say, this is my house. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's not your house. It belongs to the bank, and it'll take you 30 years to pay off. And if the whole economy functions on borrowed capital, then you're going to see the kind of crisis that we have seen both in the United States of America and in Europe. And therefore, what do you do at the end? You have to act responsibly. Who will make you act responsibly? Not those whose only aim in life is to make a profit. So what are the interventions that are required? Who decides on the interventions? What kind of interventions should take place? What kind of regulations should take place? Is the government the right forum for doing that? Or is there any other self-mechanism that will allow that to happen? All these are fundamental questions that all of us have yet to answer. I think there is an enormous tension between compassion and capitalism. We can't do without capitalism, and of course, compassion is central to everything in life. So let me end by something I had written about the global meltdown in a minute, and that's how I'll end my intervention. The world has changed since Bretton Woods. The world has changed since Bretton Woods. Finance is meant for global good. Our Wall Street czars must tread with care, for Main Street is the real player. Regulation provides the key, coupled with real transparency. Investment banks attempt to lure their profit motive distilled and pure. Financial structures, when put in place, need to display a human face. Rich must prosper, so must the poor. Our thoughts alone will not ensure. New global banks must help sustain those afflicted by financial strain, prevent collapse and devastation, financial systems aberration. The corporate world, and some of you are sitting here, must take the lead, seek wealth without avarice and greed. Dupe not holders of equity. The key word is integrity. Values, ethics must underscore the desire to acquire more. Revamp, reform, inspire trust, make sure the system is robust.
I understand your point, Mr. Sybil, about the inherent tension. And of course, you said that growth is necessary to finance the equal opportunities you spoke about. But there is a view that the Congress party and some of your allies are all compassion and no capitalism at all, which will eventually drive us to low growth and bankruptcy, and you'll end up distributing the poverty you were saying we shouldn't redistribute.
Well, you know, if you talk, you know, the numbers say otherwise. I mean, if you look at UPA 1, you had 9% growth in 3 fiscals. If you look at UPA 2, despite the global crisis, we had 8.4% in the last 2 fiscals. So nobody can say it's all compassion and no capitalism. There's a lot of capitalism and there's a lot of compassion, but there's a tension between the two.
But are you happy with the pace of economic reform or free market reform?
No, you're never absolutely happy. Are you happy with the media? No. We're not absolutely happy. We can't be. There's so much more to be done. So much more we want to do, but there are compulsions. And you are aware of the compulsions. And I don't want to make news this afternoon, so.
Dr. Cable, Britain has, of course, been, as you said, a model of Anglo-Saxon economics, which is more open than, say, the continental European economies. Do you see blowback of any kind from the financial crisis? Is the state coming back as Big Brother?
Well, certainly in the financial sector, that is the case. And there was an enormous amount of hubris in the banking system, producing very complex products that the bankers themselves didn't understand, shadow banking that threatened the whole system. And what's now happening is that, you use the phrase blowback, but there certainly is a mood in all the major Western countries that were affected, and particularly in Britain and the United States, to have a more regulated banking and financial system. One of the major reforms that my government has put through, and it involved my working with the Chancellor, is actually splitting the big global banks through what we call ring fencing, so that you separate traditional banking, lending to business, lending to consumers, separating that from what we sometimes call the casinos, the investment banking operations. So it's done in a different way in the UK from the US and in Europe, but we have learnt lessons from the crisis, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again.